you so much, Mindy. It was a very interesting and inspiring presentation. I suggest we leave the questions for the panel so we keep them together, and we can have also a discussion with the other panelists. I suggest we continue with Tríona Lenihan from the Penal Reform International. Tríona has the role of Policy and International Advocacy Manager at PRI. She is based in London, and she has previously worked for organizations such as Global Initiative to End All Corporal Punishment for Children and the Irish Penal Reform Trust. The title of Tríona's presentation is Poverty and Marginalisation in the Criminal Justice System, the Problems and Effective Responses. So I'll leave the floor to you, Tríona, to introduce your topic.
Thank you, Gustav. I'll just share my screen. Sorry, it's doing the whole screen this time instead of the presentation, but is that okay? Can you see that? Great. Yeah, thanks for having us on the webinar as well today. I've seen some familiar names on the participants list, but for anyone that isn't familiar with Penal Reform International, we're an independent non-governmental organisation that works through a number of regional and country programmes, and our headquarters is split between London and the Netherlands. So our way of working is very much to support national authorities, so prison authorities, probation authorities, and other justice actors to implement the human rights standards in the criminal justice system for more fair and effective justice for everyone. And we take a very sort of people-centered approach with a focus on non-discrimination and doing no harm. So as part of our work in the policy programme, we publish an annual Global Prison Trends report in partnership with the Thailand Institute of Justice. And that has shown a really consistent increase in the global prison population year on year. And this year we've reached a record high of 11.5 million people worldwide in prison. So within those overall figures, as we know, there are certain groups that are disproportionately affected by imprisonment, and that ultimately drives up prison populations. So that's what I'm going to look at today, just some trends on who is in prison globally, why they're there, and what can be done or what is being done to address that disproportionate impact so that we can reduce the use of imprisonment, especially for marginalised groups, and ease the burden on prison systems. So what's driving the growth in prison numbers then, or the inability to reduce the number of people in prison? We assessed 5 key drivers in our Global Prison Trends report, and I'll mainly be discussing the first 2 today. So the impact of punitive drug policies on prison populations, and also discrimination that's based on socioeconomic status and the use of laws that criminalize people for acts associated with poverty or survival, or target people for who they are rather than what they have done, and that results in really disproportionate numbers of people living in poverty or marginalisation that are in prison. The final point there as well as sort of underlying and linked to all of these drivers that Mindy mentioned as well is the real underuse of alternatives to imprisonment. And an incredibly slow growth in the use of non-custodial alternatives globally, despite some sort of promising expansion during the pandemic. So firstly, on the punitive drug policies, an estimated 1 in 5 people in prison worldwide are there for drug offences. So that's over 2 million people. And that's a key driver of increases in prison populations, especially in Asia and the Americas. Punitive drug laws often include things like mandatory prison sentences, mandatory pretrial detention, even for very low-level offences like possession for personal use. So that has a really significant impact on prison populations and on overcrowding, especially in places where court processes might be inefficient or slow, or courts are really overwhelmed with just the number of cases. And so people end up spending really long periods of time, up to many years, in pretrial detention, just waiting for their trial to complete. And within that, then another 20% of those 2 million people are in prison for drug offences that are for drug use or possession for personal use. But there is a trend positively towards removing criminal sanctions for possession, and I'll come back to that later. Punitive drug policies also disproportionately impact women. In 2018, the UN estimated that 35% of women in prison worldwide are there for drug-related offences, compared to 19% of men. But that proportion increases dramatically in Latin America and Asia, where it's really driving the significant increase in the number of women in prison in the past 10 years or so. In Brazil, for example, 62% of women in prison in 2017 were there because of drug-related offences, compared to a quarter of men. And you can see even higher proportions on the slide as well. These figures are from a report by the Washington office on Latin America, and they're also included in PRI's 10-point plan on gender-sensitive drug policies for women, which we published with the International Drug Policy Consortium last year. But behind all of these sort of numbers and statistics is, you know, the very real human impact of punitive drug policies, which cause such inefficiency, not only in clogging up the court system and leaving people in pretrial detention for months or years, but they're also totally ineffective in tackling drug crime. And we know that short prison sentences, which are common in a lot of jurisdictions, including in Europe, are completely ineffective in tackling the root causes of offending. So whether it's linked to drug addiction or involvement in the drug trade because of poverty or lack of access to social services or other employment opportunities. So the question then is, do some of these even need to be a criminal offence, or which is creating the greater social harm? And of course, this goes much broader than just drug-related offences. There are a whole range of laws that effectively criminalise poverty or status. So in other words, laws that disproportionately affect segments of society that are living in poverty or are marginalised. This quote is from the UN Common Position on Incarceration, which was the first of its kind that was issued last year. And it really kind of sums up the interplay between poverty and poor access to justice, with the sort of harsh penal policies and the tough on crime approach that Mindy was talking about, and that sort of systemic discrimination across criminal justice systems. And that all results in this overrepresentation of the poorest and the most marginalised members of society in criminal justice systems in regions all over the world. And that's often for acts, as I mentioned, that are associated with like poverty and survival or homelessness, with very little connection to public safety. So things like criminalising loitering, begging, shoplifting, and using prison as a response to inability to pay fines, including those that are handed down by the courts, deaths, all driving prison populations and overcrowding, while also being totally ineffective for the core issues at play, and really only perpetuating the cycle of poverty because of the harms that we know are associated with imprisonment, like loss of income, loss of housing, damage to family relationships and community ties, or a negative impact on employment prospects after release as well. So these laws really disproportionately affect people who experience discrimination and social exclusion because of their economic or social status. So that includes like people who use drugs, people who are experiencing homelessness, informal traders who try to earn some money in public spaces, sex workers, members of the LGBT community, and so on. And we've seen this in all regions really. So in Sri Lanka, for example, prisons are already operating at like 190% of their official capacity, and almost 3/4 of people that were convicted in 2020 were for the inability to pay fines. And similarly, in the US, is often criticized for the number of state laws that effectively criminalize homelessness, and for criminalizing things like loitering, begging, living in a vehicle, and even sharing food in some cases. That's all punishable by fines, which of course people won't be able to pay, or arrest. And in Africa as well, we know that at least 42 countries criminalize the so-called vagrancy offences, which are often colonial legacies, the leftover from English and other laws, which refer to someone, being like a rogue or vagabond, or not being able to give a good account of yourself, or having a clear means of subsistence. So they're very sort of vague and broadly termed, and so they sort of allow for this large scale sort of approach to arrest or detention. Another typical example of bias is, of course, within Black and marginalised ethnic communities who continue to be overrepresented in criminal justice systems. In the European context, exposing the disproportionate rate of detention of people from minority groups can be difficult because of legislation in a lot of countries that doesn't allow for data to be collected that is disaggregated by race or ethnicity. And that really hinders the ability both to expose the issue and also to develop evidence-based policy measures to address it. But if we consider Roma, for example, as the largest minority ethnic group in Europe, research in a number of countries suggests that Roma people are disproportionately imprisoned compared to the general population. And we've seen that so far in places like Bulgaria, Hungary, Spain, members of the travelling community in Ireland. But it's a really massive blind spot in a lot of countries, and that's something that PRI is going to be looking at in more detail in the region, particularly in relation to access to alternatives to detention. So what do we do then, or what is being done to address this? And there are some concrete actions that are being taken by civil society in reforming national laws and using multilateral mechanisms. On the civil society front, PRI is a member of the Global Campaign to Decriminalise Poverty and Status. The campaign started in 2014 as a regional initiative in Africa, but it's expanded to reflect the really common challenges faced in all regions. The campaign seeks decriminalisation of certain offences and also reclassifying some offences either as like administrative or non-arrestable offences, or offences that can't attract pre-trial or post-conviction detention. And the campaign members do this through research and advocacy at national, regional and international level, and also through strategic litigation. So at the regional level, in terms of action or successes, the African Court on Human and People's Rights in December 2020 issued an advisory opinion which found those vagrancy offences to be incompatible with African human rights instruments. And it also found a positive obligation on states to amend or repeal those laws. And in 2017, the African Commission adopted the principles for the decriminalisation and declassification of petty offences, which also calls on states to decriminalise those very sort of broad and vague or ambiguous laws. Some of the litigation have led to changes in legislation through the courts. Successes there on the screen in Malawi and South Africa, and also another case ongoing in Sierra Leone. And in relation to drug policies, the possession for personal use has been decriminalised in 50 jurisdictions in 30 countries as of earlier this year. Research by campaign members and others as well has been effective in sort of exposing the arbitrary and discriminatory nature of the laws and how they're being implemented. So that's helped to bring about changes in how cases are prosecuted as well. We've seen new directives in Malawi and Kenya, for example, And there have also been moves in other regions, like some places in the US, where prosecutors have said they won't prosecute certain offences, or where police prioritise diversion or other options that are available to them to avoid cases going forward to prosecution. And on the multilateral front then, we've seen increasing recognition from international bodies like the UN Common Position on Incarceration that I showed the quote from earlier, that highlights these issues and the need to reduce the use of detention. PRI and other campaign partners have also been raising awareness at the UN Crime Commission through side events and working with member states towards reform. And through the Human Rights Council, a number of initiatives have been set up. So an independent expert mechanism was set up last year to examine systemic racism and human rights violations by law enforcement. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has also presented an agenda towards transformative change for racial justice and equality. And she issued a report in June last year on racial justice and equality. And some of the special procedures as well, like the UN Special Rapporteurs on the right to adequate housing and on extreme poverty and human rights. They conducted a joint overview of laws that criminalise poverty-related life-sustaining activities last year. So lots going on, but still a lot more to do.